And just to the folks who actually live on the coast, welcome to Kala Felicity, your next House District 1 representative. Thanks for joining us, Kala. And I see Gloria, Helen, I've already said hello to, and David Morse. Welcome, everybody. So my charge this evening is to talk to you about the cap, the tax, or the executive order as ways potentially of solving our greenhouse gas emissions problem. I would just like to say, looking at this slide, if you have any questions about anything that I put out here, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email. I'm so difficult to find, alan@socan.eco. And if you have any questions generally on climate issues, please send them to climatequestions@socan.eco. It's a sort of generic query line that we offer to everybody. And excuse me, I've got a dog right behind me who's scratching and he has a bell on him. Okay, he's being removed. Okay, so let's start the ball rolling. And as Bill said, we're going to have 3 breaks for questions as we go through, and then we'll have questions at the end. So please whack your questions into chat as we go. Okay, so this is the outline of my presentation. I'm going to start with, and this is actually the longest section of the presentation. I'm going to talk about the cap versus the tax fee approach. We're going to have a Q&A. Then I'm going to talk about a very brief history of the efforts in Oregon to address this problem. And then the more recent efforts, very quickly, HB 2020 in 2019, Senate Bill 1530 in 2020. We'll have another Q&A break. Then I'm going to talk about the governor's executive order, and this will be a very broad brush summary. We're not going to get into the weeds too much on that. I'll talk about what's missing from the executive order, and then I'll close with a few words about how to engage in the next process, which is starting now, and that's the rulemaking. So let's launch this ship. The first thing I'm going to talk about is what I call the climate pollution 2-step. And when Bill was introducing the topic, you will notice he talked about cap and trade. And you've probably all heard about cap and trade. You might have equally well heard about fee or tax and dividend. And the point that I'm making here is when we talk cap and trade and invest, or fee and dividend, we're really conflating 2 components of the issue. There are the 2 steps of the climate pollution 2-step. So I want to introduce this discussion by pointing out what the 2-step is. Then we'll go and have a look at the cap and the tax as approaches. So the first question we ask in this arena is, how do we reduce emissions? And there are essentially 2 ways that have been proposed at national jurisdictional levels across the world. The first one is to cap emissions and then year by year by year cap towards some goal that we have established before we start. The other approach is to impose a tax or a fee on emissions and raise that tax and fee year by year by year in the hope that that will put us on a trajectory to reduce our emissions that we want. And I'll talk much more about those 2 components in just a moment. So the second part of the issue is, if what we're doing raises any money, and you will have heard Bill talk about pricing carbon or carbon tax. And I'm going to pause for a moment and stress what we're talking about is not or should not be a carbon tax. It should not be carbon pricing. It should be greenhouse gas emissions pricing, or climate pollution prices, if you want to be sort of even more generic. So the second question is, if what we're doing is raising funds, and of course, if we impose a tax, inevitably it's going to raise money. But a cap does not have to raise money. It could just be a regulated cap. So those are the two questions. If we indeed raise money, then the sub-questions are, what do we do with the money that we raise? One option is to return any funds that we raise to the taxpayers. And that's what's called a dividend, and hence the term fee and dividend. This is the approach that the Citizens Climate Lobby prefers. It's an approach preferred by a lot of folks. Actually, many conservatives like this approach. I will say, as soon as I hear conservatives liking an approach, my detectors start going up, and I start wondering, I wonder what's wrong with this approach. But I'm not going to dwell too much on that question. A second possibility is we could use the funds that are raised to lower other taxes, income taxes, corporate taxes, or whatever. British Columbia has that kind of an approach. This is what is strictly termed a revenue neutral approach, because what we are doing is raising one array of taxes and lowering, if I can get my fingers right, lowering some other taxes to compensate. So there's no actual revenue coming into the state or federal jurisdiction, whatever jurisdiction it is, offers. The third approach is to use the funds that are being raised to invest in the community, something that we think as legislators is socially beneficial. One thing we could invest in is promoting energy conservation, energy efficiency, and rural renewable energy. Another thing that we could invest in is social injustice. The third is promoting carbon capture and sequestration from the atmosphere through forestry and agriculture. And the fourth is promoting adaptation to the changing climate. And it's not necessary that the fees that are raised or funds raised go to any one of these. It could, of course, be a combination of those factors. Okay, so let's ask some key questions. And these key questions are relevant whether we're taking the cap route or the tax route. The question is, what is it we want to target? And I kind of alluded to this a moment ago. Do we want to tax carbon or carbon dioxide emissions? Or do we want to attack greenhouse gas emissions measured in terms of their carbon dioxide equivalent over the full life cycle of their emissions? And I would submit it's the second one of these that we want to target, not the first. And I will very briefly point out that if we just attack carbon, i.e. carbon dioxide, what we're doing is missing about 35 to 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions for which we're responsible. And so it's a bit like saying we've cured cancer if we target carbon dioxide, but we've only cured one of the cancers or two of the cancers. So to me, what we absolutely have to do is make sure our target is greenhouse gas emissions measured in terms of the carbon dioxide equivalent and assessed over the full life cycle of the fossil fuel or whatever action that we're targeting. Okay, so this is again pointing out the point I just made. Are we simply going to target emissions at the end use of the fossil fuel or the end use of whatever industrial process we're looking at? Or are we going to look at the full life cycle? If we just look at the combustion emissions, de facto, what that means is pretty much we are only targeting carbon dioxide because the major greenhouse gas that results from the combustion of fossil fuels is carbon dioxide. Other greenhouse gases like methane, for example, actually result from leakage or fugitive emissions during the extraction, processing, and transmission phase. So if we really want to target greenhouse gases in a meaningful way, we really have to do it over the full life cycle of those fossil fuels. Time and time again, we see proposals coming forth that don't attack greenhouse gases and don't target full life cycle of emissions. It's not that they're totally inept and meaningless. It's just that they are not really good enough at a time when we're in dire straits and really need to address the problem very quickly. Another question, should we target just fossil fuels or should we target industrial processes as well? And I think most people looking at this problem will say, well, we should be targeting the emissions wherever they occur. Yes, it relates to fossil fuels for life cycle assessment. And yes, it relates to any industrial processes that, in addition to fossil fuel emissions, produce other emissions. The chlorofluorocarbons are a good example of emissions that result from industrial processes over which we really need to take control as well, because they are tremendous contributors on a pound-for-pound basis to the problem. Another question we have to ask is, should we, whatever we're doing, whether we're capping or whether we're imposing a tax/fee, should we do it upstream where the energy enters the economy, or should we do it downstream? And the difference here is really quite critical, because if we do it upstream where the energy enters the economy, what we find is we only have a very few entities that we need to target. And largely they're the fossil fuel extractors or importers that we target. And of course, if we target them, whether it's a cap or a tax, any price that they pay is going to be passed on to the consumer. We expect that to happen, and it's only reasonable it should, because we're all part of the problem as well. If we do it downstream, that means basically targeting you and me and the mom and pop store down the road at the point where they are consuming the energy. That becomes administratively a huge headache. So it's much more effective to target wherever we are putting the cap or the tax on, to do it as far upstream as we can go. Another question, that was what do we target? This one is, what is our goal when we are imposing some kind of a limit when we're trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, pollution? So the first question we have to ask is, what % reduction do we want to see compared to when? When is our starting date for comparing our future reduction percentage? And by when do we want to reduce it? And I'll continue with this argument a bit beyond this point. The Paris Agreement, for example, has said that we should have a goal of reducing emissions such that we do not allow an increase in global warming greater than 2 degrees centigrade, 3.7 degrees Fahrenheit, for those who did Fahrenheit, above pre-industrial conditions, which means taking us back to 1750. And they said, better if we make our goal only 1.5 degrees centigrade, 2.7 Fahrenheit above the pre-industrial level. In 2018, the Paris Agreement, by the way, I didn't put this in there, was in 2015, December 2015. In 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out with an extensive report in which they discussed what the consequences of a 2 degrees centigrade warming was. And basically what they came to, the conclusion they came to was, we should absolutely not exceed that lower level in the Paris Agreement, i.e. 1.5 degrees centigrade, 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial conditions. That same report gave us some targets in terms of actual greenhouse gas emissions. They said we should be 45% below the 2010 level by 2030. Notice what they did there was they answered the first 2 or 3 questions I posed at the top. They said, what percentage compared to what starting date by what date? And then they said, by 2050, we really need to be at net zero. And what you will find is people often talk about we need to be at zero emissions by 2050. And all I can say in response to that is just think about what you're saying. If you want zero emissions by 2050, what you're going to have to do is tell everybody on the planet and all the animals on the planet, you have got to stop breathing, because when we breathe out carbon dioxide. So what we really need is not that, I call that a kind of berserk bubble. What we need is net zero, which means we allow, as a result of our activities, emissions into the atmosphere equivalent to the capture and storage of greenhouse gases that occurs naturally or which we can stimulate. So that's what the net zero means. So let's go into some more detail on the two approaches, the cap approach and then the tax or fee approach. So the cap approach starts with us identifying a jurisdictional cap on emissions from fossil fuels and industrial processes. So we're looking at some kind of a jurisdiction. And the easiest way to think about that is a nation or a state. If we're talking about Canada, of course, is the nation or the province and so forth. The best approach is to have this nationally. I don't think anybody would disagree with that, because if you do it state by state, and that applies to whether we're doing the cap or the tax, if we do it state by state, we have the problem of different jurisdictions that are adjacent to one another having different systems in place, which makes things very complex and confusing for the economy, not to mention the people who are part of the economy. So then we establish a cap, and then we lower that cap according to some desired trajectory. And given what the IPCC has said, the trajectory really should be that, remember, that 45% below 2010 by 2035, net zero by 2050. But even if we don't do that, what we do know is it absolutely has to be a very steep, let's go this way, a very steep curve. We have to get that trajectory down very quickly because we need to be somewhere profound by 2030. This cap that we're imposing could be based on one of two kinds of greenhouse gas inventory processes. The usual approach is what's called the in-boundary inventory, which means what we're doing is assessing the greenhouse gas emissions that happen, in the case of Oregon, let's use that example, within the limits, state limits of Oregon. On the other hand, we could make this a consumption inventory, which is slightly different. If we're using a consumption basis, what we're doing is charging against ourselves the greenhouse gas emissions that result from, let's say, a TV that's made in China and then shipped to us. The consumption inventory would be better in a theoretical way, but it's incredibly difficult to do because we have to have then the greenhouse gas emissions data from the TV that we're importing from China. Very difficult data to get. So most often these approaches are in-boundary inventories. Another question we have to ask is, who is regulated? All sectors, jurisdiction-wide, all emitters? And bear in mind, if we say everyone who emits, what we're doing is including our exhaling. Or do we target those emitters that are really majorly responsible for the problem? And this is the way that the cap approach usually goes, is we target individuals, entities, whatever they are, that are responsible for greater than 25,000 metric tons of greenhouse gases measured in terms of their carbon dioxide equivalent per annum. If we are applying a cap, then we're going to have some kind of a permitting process, which those who are polluting get so many permits or allowances that allow them to permit a certain amount of emissions. We could allocate those to the emitters. We could set a fixed price for them and say, you will buy your permits at the rate of such and such per ton of greenhouse gases emissions, or we could auction them. The usual approach is basically an auction. And this is how California does it. And what California is doing currently is they're actually ahead of their schedule for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the rate at which the emissions are being bought at auction is about $15 a ton of emissions. However, the wrinkle is that even if we are doing an auction of allowances, there are certain principles that we have to bring into the consideration that protect individuals in the community. And the result, and I'll talk about that in just a second. The result of that is some entities will get some free allowances. They're still part of the program, but they get some free allowances, or they get subsidized allowances. And the particular targets for this kind of a consideration are utilities. Because one of the problems that's going to happen, and it's inevitable, is that if we put a price, or if we cap emissions and auction the allowances, what that will do is result in the utility increasing its fossil fuel costs for generating electricity. And what the utility will presumably do is pass that on. And so one of the components of bills, and this is true for the Oregon bills, one of the components is to provide utilities with some kind of a system which precludes them from the need to put up the cost of natural gas, for example, or electricity to low-income Oregonians. And so that's a way of protecting low-income residents. The other thing that folks try to do is prevent what is called leakage. And this is not like leakage of natural gas or fugitive emissions. This refers to a slightly different concept of leakage. What we're trying to prevent or reduce here is the likelihood of some really obnoxious polluter simply saying, oh, I'm out of here. And so they take their industry to a neighboring state that has no such approach to reducing emissions. And so they keep on polluting. So what has happened is we have kind of cleaned up Oregon, but in a global sense, we've done nothing beneficial because the polluters have just moved across the border. So we don't want to do that. So what we try and do is have some special allowance such that those entities which are called, fall into the category of emissions intensive or trade exposed industries, we have some kind of allowance that provides them with protection against too dramatic assault on their emissions. Then, of course, we have to have penalties. So what happens if somebody pollutes to a greater extent than the allowances that they have? There has to be some kind of a penalty, and this really needs to be a pretty serious penalty, otherwise it becomes price of business. And the way in which this is worked out is the entity, the polluting entity, at the end of whatever the cycle is, let's call it a year, has to hand in what are called compliance instruments. These are the allowances they obtained. They have to hand those back into the supervising agency, equivalent to the report of greenhouse gas emissions that they have being responsible for during that period of time. One of the benefits of the cap approach is it is a direct regulation of emissions. So we decide ahead of time how many million tons of greenhouse gas emissions we're going to allow within the jurisdiction. And then we target the major polluters and we actually reduce emissions. So it's a direct regulator of emissions. It is, however, as you can see, if we go with the auction approach, it has an indirect pricing effect. So going into the system, and this is one of the disadvantages, potential polluters don't know what the price will be of the allowances at auction. And so for businesses, this becomes a bit of a problem because it's very difficult for them to factor into their annual budget and 5-year plan and so forth, an unknown quantity as to how much they're going to be paying for their emissions. And this is one of the reasons that some folks prefer the tax approach, which I'll get to in a second, because there the tax is stated and market. One of the things that can happen with most of these systems is polluters can trade unused allowances. And I'm going to show what I think is a really neat graphic illustrating this in just a nanosecond. This will also illustrate one of the other elements of the cap approach, and that is offsets. So we'll talk about that, and I'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages as we go through this discussion. So here's my really neat animation on emissions credit trading and offset. So imagine, as you can see here, we have this scofflaw industry that has its emissions allowances, which permitted it to emit that much greenhouse gases. And it wasn't very effective at reducing its emissions, so it actually produced this amount, okay? So imagine over here, we have another industry. This industry has bought its allowances, and so it's got an emissions cap around here. But this industry, maybe because it is in a technological area where reducing emissions is cheaper and more possible. So what they have done is reduce their emissions substantially, considerably more than they needed to do. So they're way below the amount of allowances they have. So what they can do is take money from the scofflaw company over here, and they can then hand to that company the allowances that they didn't use. And the result is some of these emissions from the scofflaw company are sort of de facto transferred to the really effective company. One of the benefits of this is that it allows companies for which it is technologically very difficult to lower emissions to take advantage of the fact that another company can lower its emissions more effectively and more easily. And it also allows that company on the left of this chart, which has really done a great job of reducing its emissions, it actually gets rewarded for reducing its emissions over and above the cap that it had for itself. The disadvantage to this approach is that sometimes the trading system of allowances can become a little trouble in the sense that folks do have. I know it's hard to believe, but some industries will do anything they can to beat the system. And so there are always efforts to find loopholes. And that's one of the criticisms of trading allowances in this fashion. Another approach So let's say our scofflaw company hasn't quite managed to unload all its emissions through trading allowances with the good folks on the left. Another possibility is to that this company could what is called buy offsets. So imagine over here we have Farmer Brown, and Farmer Brown would really, really like to grow a forest and sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But Farmer Brown doesn't have enough money to prepare the ground and buy the seedlings to grow his forest and then manage the forest. So what Farmer Brown can do is he's trying to capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. What he can do is get money from the scofflaw company to help him produce his forest. And as his forest is growing, what he's doing is sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and he can then provide that as a credit to the company, the scofflaw company that's having problems with its excessive emissions. Now, the benefit to this approach is, in addition, I should show the next animation. The benefit to this is, through this system of offsets, we can promote things that otherwise would not have been happening. We can promote forest growth for carbon sequestration. We can promote regenerative agriculture, which is a much improved agricultural technique over the conventional industrial agriculture with which we're familiar. Or we can stimulate the construction of wind farms or solar farms, which have the benefit of producing energy, again, without the kind of greenhouse gas emissions that conventional fossil fuel generation utilities produce. So all of this can be funded by means of offsets. There is, however, a downside of offsets, which we have to acknowledge. The first one, obviously, is the same problem that we talked about with the trade, and that is we can certainly get entities that are trying whatever they can to beat the system. But another problem is, if this scofflaw company here is producing a whole array of air pollutants, which usually happens if you're producing greenhouse gases, it conceivably could continue to pollute while buying offsets. And if this company is located, as is often the case with oil refineries and coal mines and whatever, if that's located in the middle of a community of individuals, what they can do is they could conceivably do is buy offsets and continue to pollute the air around them, and therefore provide toxins to the lives of the people living around them. And that's one of the big criticisms of allowing too many offsets. However, there are things that we can do to reduce that. In fact, in the case of Oregon's legislation, both House Bill 2020 and Senate Bill 1530 had clauses in which the Department of Environmental Quality was able to say to corporations who might be in that situation, you cannot buy offsets if you're going to continue polluting in this particular area. So we have ways of controlling the problems with trading allowances and offsets. The solutions to the problems are in the rulemaking. And this is why it's so critical that those of us who are concerned about all of these problems are involved in the rulemaking. Okay, I actually wondered if we should have taken a break after that, but maybe we'll stick with the promised schedule, and I'll do a quick on the tax fee approach. I don't have quite so much to say about this one. This does the same thing. It's a direct imposition of fees on fuels according to emissions resulting from the fossil fuel use or industrial processes, which actually result in emissions. This system assumes that the added price will encourage utilities, energy generators, to transition to renewable energy. And as the cost of that tax is passed on to the consumer, it will encourage us as consumers to look for items we want to buy that were made by companies that are not polluting, because they won't have to pay any kind of a greenhouse gas emissions tax. So it encourages the polluter and us as consumers to be wiser. The fee often proposed in a tax fee proposal is $15 per ton, rising annually until goals are met. And what they do is they raise it usually $5 or $10 a year. And if they're smart, they'll say, well, if we're not on the trajectory, we'll raise it even more. If we are well on the trajectory, they might say, well, we'll raise it a bit less, so that can be a bit flexible. But one of the problems is with the carbon tax and this $15 a ton idea is when the Oregon State Legislature commissioned, and this was back in 2013, commissioned a study from Portland State University on the impact of a greenhouse gas emissions tax on the economy. What they did was model the consequences of different values of the tax. I'm going to show you this in a second. And they said, even if we impose a tax of $150 per ton, we would not achieve the goals that we established in our voluntary 2007 greenhouse gas emissions program. I know I haven't talked about that yet, but I'm going to just a few minutes. So the problem, one of the problems with this is the pricing is direct, but the impact on emissions is indirect. It assumes energy generation and use transitions to a less emitting fuel process. Problem, in an expanding economy, folks, and that means you and me as consumers and industries as polluters, might just suck up the tax as the price of doing business and continue emitting. And this is the chart that I promised you. This was the chart that was produced by the Northwest Economic Research Center of Portland State University, NERC at PSU. And let me draw to your attention. So these are the energy emissions in millions of metric tons of carbon dioxide on the vertical axis. And on the right-hand side, the percent difference relative to 1990. And the reason we're doing 1990 is because the 2007 program was constantly related to 1990. The top line here constitutes the doing nothing approach, and you can see what that would do as a result in a slow but gradual increase in emissions. The $10 per ton provides this line here. $30 per ton produces this line here, and so on down here. And here's the $150 per ton line, and that's down here. But the problem is, the goal for that 2007 bill was down here. And so what you can see is not even $150 per ton was going to achieve the outcome that was anticipated in that legislation. And indeed, the 2050 goal was down here. So there's no way $150 a ton is going to get us, assuming the models are accurate, it's going to get us where we need to go. So that's the downside, big downside of the the greenhouse gas emissions tax fee approach. Another big problem with that in Oregon is, in Oregon, we need a 3/5 majority in both chambers in order to pass something which clearly raises revenue and of course tax does. That's the trajectory we need to be on if we want to conform to our 2007 program. You can see we start off doing pretty well if we are charging a lot of dollars per ton, but towards the end of that cycle, we're way short of where we need to be. Okay, question and answer.
Okay, Alan, we've got a number of people made some interesting comments, and some of you were able to answer. Some of them were observations. Doug Bunn was saying it's nice because it incentivizes groups or companies to innovate and such, which is true. Kala has asked some really good questions, some of which we'll hold off to the end. But as she had said, that in the 2013 slide, notes this is a broad statement. How would there be varied benefits and varied costs?
Shall we go back to the slide? Is it this one? Is that the slide that she was referring to?
I believe so, yeah.
And so repeat the question. What was the question again?
This is a broad statement. You had made a broad statement regarding that slide. How would there be varied benefits and varied costs?
Well, the benefit would be the problem that this slide conveys to me is, in order to reach a trajectory that the red dashed line suggests we should be on, what we have to do is put a fee on greenhouse gas emissions that is, it's inordinate, because $150 just doesn't do it. $150 a ton. Remember, with the cap approach, the point that I made was California's rate was $15 a ton, and that actually is working. What this is telling us is $150 a ton is not going to be good enough. So what do we have to charge? $250 a ton to make the tax fee approach work? And think about how much people squealed when with the California approach, and continue to squeal at $15 a ton. Imagine how much people would squeal at $200 a ton as a starting point for putting a tax on emissions. And I mean, and I would think probably justifiably so, because that kind of a price on emissions is going to have put a tremendous dent in the economy. So folks who are really upset about the cap and trade approach and then propose a fee, actually what happens is the Republicans have a history of proposing a carbon fee of $15 a ton. So what they're doing is they're proposing an approach that they pretty damn well know will not get through the legislature, because it needs a 3/5 majority. And even if it does, it cannot possibly be effective, because look, this is the $10 line, and this is the $30 line. So if we put $15 on, it's just going to become somewhere in the middle here. So the cost of doing that is it's not effective. Now, it probably will reduce emissions somewhat, but it's not effective enough. And the big problem we have is with the tax fee approaches, where whenever they're proposed, even by the good guys, the amount of money that they're putting into the tax is always almost inconsequential in terms of what it is we see we need. And so this is the problem with an indirect approach. It's a direct approach on the amount of money, so we know, and this is why I'm guessing the conservatives really like it, because businesses, if we say to them, you're going to be paying $15 per ton of emissions, they can factor that into their budget, and they can deal with it better than they can, as I was mentioning before, with the auction approach, where they don't really quite know how much they're going to have to be paying for emissions. So to me, that's a real disadvantage. Now, if we put a tax on which is high enough to really to persuade utilities to switch to some other energy source, to persuade those in transportation to switch to some other energy source, then we're ahead of the game, then that's good. But look how much that charge has to be for it really to be effective. And that's a real problem. Do you think that answered the question? Or did I just ramble on?
I think it did. We're getting a number of questions about this. Chris Nadenstad asked about what causes the curve to flatten. And Kala had asked a question about forests. How about we hold on to both those, sort of park them to the side. I allow you to continue going, and we come back to those. Both are really good questions.
And let me say to Kala, I can see she, as I said, did I answer the question? She was, I think, shaking her head. Just shoot me an email, Kala, and I'll do the best I can to answer it at alan@socan.eco. I'll do the best I can. Okay, so let's cruise on to the next thing. This is a brief history in time, and I'm sorry, I did talk about the 2007 effort in the previous segment, so you already knew what it was, but now I am going to come back and tell you what that was. In 2007, House Bill 3543 was passed by the legislature and signed into law by Ted Kulongoski. And that dealt with regulated greenhouse gas emissions. And let me make a point that one of the things that the state tends to do, and it makes sense to me, is they focus on those greenhouse gas emissions that fall into the category of regulated. That means they are already being measured. They already have a mechanism for figuring out what they are. They're called regulated emissions. That doesn't mean they cover all emissions. I mean, that may be where Kala was going with forestry emissions, I'm not sure, but we might get to that in a moment. So this was the target for House Bill 3543. By 2010, they wanted to arrest the growth in Oregon's greenhouse gas emissions. That didn't happen. By 2020, achieve 10% below 1990 levels, and by 2050, achieve 75% below 1990 levels. I confess, I don't know why 1990 was picked. I have a suspicion it's because that might have been when the Department of Environmental Quality really started to engage a reasonably accurate measure of greenhouse gas emissions. I don't know. I'm not going to say I wasn't born then, but I wasn't here in Oregon at that time. Downside of that program was it was purely voluntary. And anybody who thinks for a moment about how voluntary goals work will realize, well, if it's purely voluntary, what incentive is there for people to achieve the goals? And the answer is none. That bill also established the Oregon Global Warming Commission, which was charged with trying to come up with educational and incentives for people, companies, utilities, etc., to reduce their emissions. It also established the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute, otherwise known as OCRI, well known to anybody who spends their time exploring the science of climate in the Pacific Northwest, and that's based at Oregon State University. From 2015 to 2018, many bills were proposed and all of them stalled in the legislature. Most of them got held up in Ways and Means, which is a sort of a standard place for bills to go to die. In 2019, House Bill 2020, which was the result of a considerable amount of discussion between legislators and the public, and we had all kinds of study groups and work groups exploring various aspects of 2020. That bill, we're not sure whether that bill would have actually passed the Senate. It passed the House, but we're not sure whether it would have passed the Senate. It was a close call. The passage was within 1 or 2 votes. We don't know if it would have passed, but they never got to vote on it because the Republicans just walked out. And this is kind of the story of election in Oregon. This chart depicts where Oregon is going in relation to that House Bill 3543 from 2007. So let's have a look through this. I just want to make a note. See down here at the bottom, it says electricity use. I've seen this mistake again and again and again, and I don't know why they keep doing it, but electricity use does not result in greenhouse gas emissions. That's why we encourage people to switch to electricity. What results in greenhouse gas emissions is the production of the electricity if it comes from coal or oil or natural gas. And so for some reason, DEQ hasn't quite got a hold of that idea. Okay, so this is the 1990 level. One of the interesting points you'll notice, remember I talked about the IPCC, excuse me, having goals of such and such a reduction compared to 2010 emissions. What you'll notice is in Oregon, our emissions went up, they sort of down, stabilized up again. And then, like a lot of the United States, when the recession hit, the emissions dropped. And so by 2010, we were certainly above our 1990 emissions, but not by much. However, by 2020, we'll be substantially higher, more above that level. So this is the historical pattern up till 2017 when these data were compiled. Then the red dashed line represents the future. And anybody who looks at this chart is going to say, what the hell happens in 2030? It's a really excellent question. And the answer is, if you cast your mind back, Senate Bill 1547 was passed in 2016. I'm sure you're going to remember all these numbers. They're going to be on the exam before you get to eat supper. The Oregon legislature passed what was subtitled the Coal to Clean Bill. And what the Coal to Clean Bill did was it said by 2030, electricity that is marketed in Oregon, whether it's generated outside the state or inside the state, shall not be produced by coal. So what this modeling of the future, what I think the modelers did is rather than infer that the utilities would be gradually slowing down their use of coal, they kind of programmed into their models the notion that it gets to the year 2039 and then suddenly they're going to stop using coal and transition to something else overnight. And so if you'll see this big drop here, it's exactly paralleled by the drop in emissions resulting from electricity generation. And all of these other sectors in the economy just continue on about the same level of emissions that they had before. So what this is showing us is if we just continue doing what we're doing, by 2050, that parenthesis represents how far short we will be of the goal established by 2007. So this illustrates exactly why from 2015 through 2018, 19, and 20, the climate activist coalition in Oregon was trying to push the legislature to do something meaningful, right? We didn't suddenly discover this. This trend has been very obvious. So 2019 and 2020, in 2019, we had House Bill 2020, a cap trade and invest bill, which, as I mentioned, was thwarted because the Republicans walked out of the Senate. In 2020, we had Senate Bill 1530, which was a cap trade and invest program that had been, it had been sort of built on the 2020 bill, but had been substantially modified to take into consideration a lot of the concerns and criticisms that had been expressed by people across the state, particularly the Republicans in the legislature. But again, the Republicans walked out. In fact, they walked out of both the House and the Senate. And they didn't just thwart action on climate, although what they say time and time again is this was done because they needed to protect Oregonians from those evil Portlanders who are trying to screw the rural economy. But they didn't just stop Senate Bill 1530, they actually thwarted action on some 150 other proposals that were being considered by the legislature. So when Republicans say we were trying to protect you from 1530, the response is, but what about all the other stuff that you threw down the toilet at the same time? And so this is an array of some of the other things that were being considered by the legislature at that time that the Republican walkout thwarted. And one of the things you'll notice, one of the elements here is wildfire preparedness and forest management. And so all of those Republicans are constantly complaining, and we have one down here in Southern Oregon, constantly complaining about wildfires. They threw out actions which were being proposed to deal with wildfire problems, along with throwing out Senate Bill 1530. And as a result of the Republican walkout, the governor, who had made a commitment to identify action on climate as a top priority for her during the 2020 session, she was almost forced to develop a program to replace Senate Bill 1530, which the Republicans had thwarted by walking out. And one of the ironies in what we're going to talk about in just a second is there are aspects of Senate Bill 1530 which were incredibly beneficial, and this is the investment component, incredibly beneficial to many Oregonians, particularly rural coastal Oregonians, that for various reasons are not as able to be included in the governor's executive order. And I'll talk about that as we get towards the end of the discussion. And I think we're ready for some more questions if you have any.
Yeah, let's see. There's some sort of discussion about a little bit back on cap and trade, but one was, let's see if I can summarize it properly. One had to do with in the cap and trade, where outside parties will essentially scam the system. They will buy the offsets, or excuse me, buy the permits or buy the credits, and then sell them back at a higher price for the people that absolutely have to have it. Are you familiar with that?
Well, I am familiar with that, and that's something that some people are concerned about. But the point is, that is a rule-making issue. You can always include into the rules requirements that purchasers of allowances shall not use that as a sort of a financial manipulation mechanism. So so one of the issues is when you just throw ideas up, there are clearly potential flaws in them. But rather than throwing out the baby along with the bathwater, right, you make sure that the rules address the problems that you can see part of the system. And we can do that.
All right. We're getting some interesting questions, but what I'd like to do is to kind of hold off to the end, because these become broader questions that I think that would be better by doing that, we can have more of a discussion at the end. How about we do that, if that's okay, if I don't get any revolutions? How about?
Okay. Okay, I got a thumbs up from Helen and Kala.
Cool.
Okay, so let's press on. Okay, so let's go to the governor's executive order. When I first came across this, and I discovered that she had charged 16 agencies with working on climate change, I was so naive, I thought that must be nearly all the agencies. Well, it turns out there are 125 agencies, boards, commissions, or whatever that fall within the Department of Administrative Services. So she's not tasking every agency with something, but she is tasking these agencies with doing things to reduce Oregon's greenhouse gas emissions. So let's go through the executive order. And as I said before, I'm really doing a quickie. So this is a quick float across the top. The first thing that's relevant is that she established in her executive order by 2035, we should be 45% below 1990 levels in greenhouse gas emissions. By 2050, 80% below 1990. She then charged state agencies with exercising their authority and their discretion to achieve these goals. This doesn't mean that the agencies are just going to reduce their own agency emissions, but they're going to engage in interactions with the public activities over which they have authority to get the rest of the community to reduce their emissions. And the caveats are these should be undertaken in a cost-effective manner and prioritizing actions that help vulnerable populations and impacted communities. So the government is very much aware that she has no authority to raise money. And so she cannot generate funds that then would be invested into addressing the problems confronted by vulnerable populations and impacted communities. But what she can do is charge the agencies with making sure that addressing concerns of those communities are top of the list. She then said that these agencies were required to make reports by May the 15th, which you will realize on how they propose to address their charge. She also established an interagency work group which had the responsibility of assessing climate impacts on two impacted communities. And I'll talk a little bit more about this down the line when we get to social justice issues. So let's take this sort of bite at a time. In terms of the cap and reduce emissions, she is charging that large stationary sources, which are currently responsible for a substantial amount of our emissions in the state, the utilities 26%, industry 6.5%. The Public Utilities Commission is charged with promoting decarbonization of our fossil fuel base, our fossil fuel economy, our energy economy, and promoting greenhouse gas emissions reductions and electrification infrastructure. In terms of transportation fuels, which are 40% of our emissions, and this is gasoline and diesel, and also other liquids and gaseous fuels, these have to reduce their emissions at the rate according to the trajectory identified in the previous slide. Transportation, there are two ways that transportation is going to be expected to reduce its emissions. At least two. It's not necessarily limited to these two, but there are specific charges in terms of the clean fuel standards. Currently, these are life cycle emissions assessments of greenhouse gases resulting from fuel use. They currently have a goal of declining 10% from the 2015 level by 2025. What Governor Brown did was say, no, we're going to make that more stringent. By 2025, it has to be 20%, and by 2035, it has to be 25% below 2015 levels. She has also encouraged clean fuel credits for electrification. So what she is encouraging is that by 2020, we should have 50,000 electric vehicles on our highways. By 2025, 250,000. By 2030, 25% of registered vehicles should be electric. 50% of new vehicles should be electric. And she's charged the Environmental Quality Commission and the DEQ with generating methods to achieve these goals, not all by regulation. I will say this again and again. It's by education, incentives, and regulation. Food waste is actually 2.6% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. I don't have data for Oregon, but I don't see why it's going to be different from a national basis. So the goal is to reduce this 50% by 2030 with a combination, as I said, of education, incentives, and regulation. Also, landfill methane emissions will be regulated, and they will be aligned. What she wants to do is align the standards for methane emissions from landfills with the most stringent standards amongst bordering states. Buildings, efficiency goals are going to be established for residential and commercial buildings. By 2030, 60% reduction in new building annual energy consumption. So new buildings will be targeted to be more energy efficient. And the Building Codes Division of the Department of Consumer and Business Service is charged with evaluating progress over the next 3 cycles, and they're going to be updating what are called REACH codes. And if you're like me, you will have had no idea what that means. So I looked it up. These are codes which promote improved construction standards and performance and efficiency over and above the minimum required. So what this is going to do is to try to increase beyond the minimum the energy savings in buildings. In terms of natural and working lands, the Oregon Global Warming Commission is charged with the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, the Oregon Department of Forestry, and the Department of Agriculture in promoting efforts to stimulate carbon sequestration in our natural and working lands. This means, of course, in our forests and agriculture. In terms of forests, this means modifying, promoting forest management practices that capture and store carbon dioxide from the atmosphere rather than release them. And in the case of agriculture, it's a case of encouraging agricultural systems in Oregon to switch from industrial agriculture, which destroys soil quality, and promotes agriculture. Innovation is going to be encouraged. So we're going to be encouraging industrial greenhouse gas emissions reduction through innovation. The State Environmental Quality Commission will be doing this through incentivizing the adoption of new technologies and processes. In terms of the utilities, the Public Utility Commission is going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the utility sector according to the overall schedule that I mentioned in the first slide, increasing renewable energy and energy use efficiency, diversifying energy supply, encouraging electric companies to support transportation electrification, and developing programs to reduce the hazards that we know come from utilities that promote wildfire. So we're going to need some wildfire protection plans. We're going to be encouraging clean energy appliances. The Department of Energy is going to update energy efficiency for products to the most efficient, most stringent standards amongst West Coast states. This is going to create jobs in clean transportation, construction, energy efficiency, and more, clean the air, and provide us with healthier environments for our communities. In terms of health, the Oregon Health Authority is charged with producing an annual report on public health impacts of climate change, health risks faced by vulnerable populations especially, and these include seniors, children, low-income communities, communities of color, tribes, and rural communities, and this is supposed to report by September of this year. The same authority is going to work on occupational safety and health administration activity to propose standards to protect workers from extreme heat, wildfire smoke, and other climate impacts. This is supposed to be completed by June the 30th, 2021, so they have a year to do this. According to the Oregon budget, there's going to be a commitment to tackle wildfire risks, and I'm going to come back to that Oregon budget in a moment. In terms of youth, the Oregon Health Authority is charged with conducting a study on the impacts of climate change on youth depression and mental health. They're going to complete that again. They have a year by June 2021. In terms of equity and social justice, this was a big concern for the governor in her executive order. And I mentioned the governors are going to convene an interagency work group, and these are the agencies that are going to be represented on that work group that is going to target climate impact, the impacts on impacted communities. Native American tribes, communities of color, rural communities, low-income communities, and other underrepresented communities. State agencies are required to prioritize actions that help impacted communities and consult with the Environmental Justice Task Force on any mitigation and adaptation priorities and plans they develop. And in cooperation with the Oregon Housing and Community Services, the Public Utility Commission is going to consider and mitigate the energy burden that is imposed on low-income and impacted communities, other inequities, and the whole question of designing rates of utilities. The Oregon budget, when Kate Brown signed this executive order, March the 10th, I was lucky enough to be there, I guess. And one of the things she did was make a very strong commitment that she would, recognizing that she doesn't have the capacity to raise money and then allocate investments to just environmental justice, social justice, impacted communities, she made a commitment that in her future budgets, she would have line items of funds targeting those kind of issues. And one of the things that she committed to was establishing a just transition fund. This has been a critical component of the legislation over the last several years. The Just Transition Fund provides funds for workers who are dislocated by transition, energy transition, and it provides them with training for good paying jobs in the clean energy economy. And the governor made a commitment that she would fund that. Unfortunately, COVID-19 struck, and so now the state's budget is in all kinds of hurt, several $1 billion in the hole. And so exactly what's going to happen to the commitments that she made in good faith back in March is not clear. I think we're here. And the last section is only a couple of slides, so it's not a big one.
Yeah, why don't we push through that? We've got about 15 minutes to the end, and that way we'll wrap it up rather than sort of miss out to the last section. If that work?
Okay.
Good.
Like a plan. Okay, so what's missing from the energy, the executive order? One of the things that the governor does not have the authority to do is to impose any kind of a fee-raising system that would mean people had to buy allowances. However, the Department of Environmental Quality is talking about establishing some kind of a compliance instrument, but they haven't decided, again, we're into rulemaking, how that's going to be released and to whom those would be allocated or released or how it would be distributed. An auction is not going to be part of the system. We know that. There is not going to be money for investments because there is no auction. So the only option that DEQ has in terms of imposing fees is they can impose fees on polluters in order to cover the cost of the administration of the program. But they can't impose fees that will generate any money above that. So, as I said, before COVID-19, the government made a funding commitment for the budget, but we don't know how that's going to play out. So, what's the status for engagement? The agencies, as I mentioned a moment ago, were charged with coming up with a proposal by May the 15th. Most of them did that by sort of within a couple of weeks of May the 15th. As of June the 22nd, this is the status of those reports. All of those underlined, all of those agencies have submitted their initial reports. The only one that hasn't is, as you can see, the Department of Administrative Services, which is actually, ironically, the governor's own in-house kind of agency. What we as SOCAN are doing is attempting to get engaged in the rulemaking in as many areas as we possibly can. Because as I said, where the rubber meets the road in developing the climate action plan is in the rulemaking. So if we want to prevent problems, such as the one that was raised about people scamming the system and buying so if that's indeed how instruments are distributed, then we have to make sure that's in the rulemaking. It's very, very important for rural and coastal Oregonians to engage. And I can't stress this anywhere near enough. And the reason is, throughout our experience in attempting to get the legislature to pass meaningful greenhouse gas emissions legislation, what we have had is a constant pushback of misinformation from our Republican colleagues and industries and individuals who are opposed to climate action, that is couched strongly in the context of this is all a plan by those radicals in Portland that are trying to address climate change on the backs of rural Oregonians. One of the things we have going on down here in Southern Oregon is a group called the Rural Oregon Climate Political Action Committee, which is attempting to push back against that mindset. One of the things that SOCAN can do is endorse candidates, whereas ROCPAC can. So if you are interested in getting involved in any way in the rulemaking, please shoot me an email and give me a clue as to what area is your area of interest, and I'll do whatever I can to engage you with us or with Renew Oregon's teams of activists. And that's it. 10 minutes left. Sorry.
Well, we have about 35 to 60 minutes of questions and comments and things. So we've got, Marina asked about your email, which is very simple. It's just, if I get it right, alan@socan.edu.
It's right here on this slide.
There you go. So there were a couple things, as you were just talking about, sort of the devil's in the details of the regulations and all that. And from what it seems to me, in order to get the details right, it does require a bit of trust, because you can either write all the details in the legislation, or you can give the principles and the main things there, and then, like you said, in the regulations, work out the specifics, which is probably better than having it in a open deliberative body. What's your take on that?
Well, that's exactly the problem that we've been having throughout the period of time that we have been working on legislation. The first item of the first piece of legislation was really written. Actually, I think this was maybe 2015. I'm not. Things are getting really problematic for me. I think it was 2015. It was House Bill 3047 or something. Okay, I failed that test. And that bill was written very much like the executive order, with sort of aspirational goals and concerns. And it really charged the Department of Environmental Quality with the task of coming up with the rules on how this would be actualized. And when that failed, the next year, the legislators who were engaged with us on that one said, we want to come up with a bill that now has all of the details in the bill. And I think it would be reasonable to say our response was, geez, that's not a good idea. Somebody had talked to Ted Kulongoski and got his advice, and he had said, legislatures are abysmal at detail. They're good at big picture, but they're abysmal at detail. And the reason is, and this will be pretty clear to anyone, as soon as I say it, people will say, well, yeah. The problem is, if you put, well, we are going to assign 10% of our investments for tribes, say, then as soon as you put a percentage in, you're going to get into a debate about, wait a minute, I think it should be 9%. No, I think it should be 11%. I think it should be 8%. And you get into stupid discussions about minutia in the details. And those kinds of things derail discussions in committees. And then when you get to the floor of the chamber, then you get the same array of debates over minutia. So yes, it's a real problem. I don't have the answer to it. I prefer big picture things and assign the rulemaking to the agencies. But there are many folks in the legislature who totally distrust the agencies. You know, these are the anti-government people. So those government people have got to be evil, so they're not going to do what's best for us. So it's a real problem, but we're here now. It's in the rulemaking that we have to get engaged.
So that seems to really cry out for engagement, which is what you've been.
Oh gosh, totally, yeah.
Jumping back to the cap and trade and the potential for abuse, and if I can correctly sort of summarize what Chris had said, he was talking about a forest owner threatening to clear cut trees unless they get paid for offsets. And generally it's, how have other states or other nations worked out how to manage offsets without getting scammed?
It's not easy, but I think you know there are situations, and that's a perfect illustration one. If somebody does that, you can sort of look at them and say, well, you're full of crap.
Yeah. Well, I had.
Or you simply say you have a mechanism, maybe not in the bill, but as a companion, that we need to modify our forest management practices to discourage that kind of behavior. And we have real problems in Oregon when it comes to forest management, because one of the things we don't have is what's called a severance tax. So in terms of forestry, Oregon is operating as a third world country, unlike Washington and California, which, you know, if you harvest trees from your private land, you pay a severance tax for that. Oregon, we don't.
Yeah.
So there are ways of addressing those kinds of issues.
And in addition, with respect to the offsets, which did have a lot of opportunities for scamming and such, but there are some very well established not regulatory, there are private NGOs that do specifically the evaluation and the verification that the offsets do meet a set of criteria, one of which you talked about leakage, but it's in a different sense. That's verifiable, and so there are ways of doing it. What it really comes down to, it would be, rather than identifying those in the legislation, saying it would meet the gold standard, which is actually the name of one of the standards. That's the gold standard. Anyway, so there are systems in place. Go ahead.
Yeah, the bills themselves said that offsets had to be verifiable, that they were verifiable, that they really did either suck greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere or reduce emissions. They had to be activities that would not otherwise have happened, and they had to be certified. And this is what you're talking about. They got to be certified as being as doing what they claim they're doing. And yes, it's always possible for somebody to say, well, I'm growing trees and they're sucking in 10 tons of carbon dioxide a year. Demonstrate that to me.
Yeah.
Got to be verified.
And Kala had asked questions along those lines in terms of how many acres of Oregon forests have already been set for sequestration and such. Those are some, I mean, there are a bunch of really good questions in here. unfortunately, we don't have enough time to go through it. From the standpoint, from your perspective, you kind of touched on it. What's the best way for the people on the, in the presentation and everybody they talk to get involved so that we make the most effective change now? I'll sort of give you your last 2 minutes to make a pitch for what do we do?
Well, I want to say two things. Yes, if you want to get involved, please let me know and give me a clue as to what kind of an area you are particularly interested in. And the other thing I do want to say is that when Governor Brown came up with this, she could only do what she could do. What we understand is, that's those of us who are in the climate activist community, what we understand is this is only as good as Kate Brown is governor. Now, if we get another governor from the Democratic Party, it's quite probable that that person will continue this program. But if we get somebody from the other party, then just as Barack Obama found it is necessary to sign executive orders because the Republican Congress wouldn't support his plans, and because and just as Trump negated pretty much everything Obama did, and most of us hope the next president will negate everything Trump has done, what we have to do is somehow get this whole idea, this Oregon Climate Action Plan, enshrined in statute. The only way that can happen is through the legislature. We know what happened in 2020. We were 2 members of the House and 2 members of the Senate short of a quorum. And so we couldn't get Senate Bill 1530 passed. If we could only get those 2 climate sympathetic members in each chamber to get us up to 20 Senate members and 40 House members who are concerned about climate, then we could enshrine this in statute. So color is important here. We need color in the House.
There you go. All right.
I didn't say that because I'm not allowed to endorse a candidate.
Well,
Thank you.
yeah. All right. So it's now 7 o'clock. I'd like to run my meetings on time and give everybody a chance to meet other commitments like dinners and things like that. We had a little bit of challenge with some of the video, or excuse me, some of the audio, but as I said before, it has been recorded. It's still actually being recorded, and we'll curate that and put it up. My expectation, for sure, we know it can be up on the Curry County Voices, and that would be posted to YouTube. But as Alan and Kathy and I have talked about, we anticipated to go up on SOCAN website as well, and a link to a SOCAN YouTube page. We'll work out the details, but we'll let everybody know where it is, and we will go from there. So what I'm going to do now.
Thanks very much indeed.
Excuse me?
Thanks very much indeed. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, I appreciate your time. And with that, I think I'm going to let everybody go and say thank you very much. And remember to tune in next month when we are having a discussion about permaculture. Actually, the principles of permaculture, and the following week, SOCAN, Alan's group in Rogue Valley, will be following up with a related set of topics too. So with that,
could you just make sure everybody knows about our SOCAN meeting on socially responsible investing next Tuesday? If anybody wants to visit that, it's next Tuesday, 6 to 7:30. Send an email to carmen@socan.eco if you want to get in the Zoom component. It's going to be live streamed through our Facebook page as well.
And so in fact, there's a whole lot of stuff going on, and we are trying to coordinate things between Coastal SoCan and Allen's SoCan as the parent organization. So there's a lot you can get involved with. So thank you very much. I apologize if anybody didn't get all the details or didn't get your questions asked. We'll just have to communicate it some more. All right, with that, I will go grab my dinner, and the rest of you, I hope you have a good evening. Thank you very much, Alan. See ya.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.